Maldonado's comments parallel Greenberg's later observation that, quote, "The first mark made on a canvas destroys its literal and utter flatness, and the result of the marks made in it by an artist like Mondrian is still a kind of illusion that suggests a kind of third dimension," end quote. So recognizing the inherent and really inescapable illusionism of painting and the inability to create an entirely flat surface led the artists of the Asociación Arte Concreto Invención, Melé included, to abandon this kind of structured frame painting en masse. By late 1946, you don't see any more of this type of painting. Again, they were produced in a very short period. By late 1946, they moved into a new type of practice, which they called, coplanars. This is the example that's here in the exhibition by Raúl Villanueva. It says 46, it's probably very late, like November, December 46, in which individual forms were suspended in space. The idea being that by not having one form touch another, all visual illusion would be eliminated. So what it does is gets rid of this problem that as soon as you place two different colors, not only does the diagonal shapes create a sense of linear perspective, but also two colors next to each other inevitably cause one of the forms to be read as closer than the other. All of these in contradiction with their desire to create an art that would be entirely flat, entirely objective, and not use any leftovers of illusionism. So this coplanar solution was a very ingenious solution to the figure ground issue that Maldonado had identified as implicit in all abstract painting. And such was the collective spirit of this group that this became the predominant, in fact the only practice of all the members in the group by the end of that year. In the coplano, the issue of the frame was essentially eliminated as the forms contained their own shapes free of any illusionism, and the compositional structure was independent of any regular geometric shape or implied frame. So the idea here again is not only does each shape only contain one color, so by not adding any compositional elements or any other color, it got rid of that question of that problem of pictorial illusionism that's implicit anytime you make a mark on a surface. But by separating them out in space, there's enough distance or empty space between each of these pieces that you read them all as being very much on the same plane, which is exactly what they wanted. I'll talk about those little rods in a minute. So works like this embodied the objective and absolute geometry that would create a different kind, for them, of non-hierarchical relationship between the artist and the viewer. The idea being that art would no longer live in a realm of the illusionary or the ideal, but that it would live as a physical object in a world of physical objects. Okay, so far so good, but what would happen next was unexpected. Just as a coplano supposedly came to resolve the issue of how art would become more autonomous and absolute, the objects themselves presented a whole new set of problems and issues. One of these was the physical difficulty of preserving an object with irregular frames and fragile structure, which is why so few survive today. And that may seem a minor point, but once this thing is not hanging on the wall, it falls apart. There's nothing to lean it against. And there really are very few. There's only one or two of these left surviving in the world today. But perhaps more important was the discovery that by incorporating the wall into the composition, or that empty space between the objects, which is so much an integral part of what this piece is about, the object was in fact more and not less dependent on the accident of its placement and surroundings. Ironically, the work needed some kind of new frame in order to isolate it if it was not going to be affected by the color of the wall, the wallpaper, or the accidents of the surface against which it was placed. So one solution was to conceive of the work in terms of a mural. And this lousy photograph shows how Raúl Villanueva intended his works to be displayed. And that's where those rods would disappear. These rods are essentially a temporal solution so that this thing can be carried around. But the idea being that this is a project for a mural. This is a project for architectural space. This would live in the world. Okay. Now, when Raúl Villanueva, the same artist, broke away from the association in 1946 and created his own movement, Perceptismo, or Perceptism, it was to maintain the belief that the coplanar solution was in fact the right one. He didn't want to leave it behind, and that the issue of the wall could be resolved by mounting the work on a field of color, as in this piece here, Invención number 150. If the frame was rectangular, so be it, as long as the rectangle was not determining the composition inside. And that's an important point. So although this thing is mounted within a frame, you'll see that if you draw the compositional lines of these pieces, of these individual pieces, they have nothing to do with the rectangle. This rectangle could be larger, could be smaller. It's not working from the edge inside. These objects have a kind of centrifugal force out into the world. And the other way of reading these is that this rectangular frame that it's in is really a fragment of a wall. It's really a substitute for an architectural solution, as opposed to being a frame that creates that single perspective illusionist effects that they were so determined to not reproduce. Now, for the other members of that original group, Tomás Maldonado, Melé, Lito, Prati, and others, the crisis of that underlying wall issue was determining, and their solution was to return back to the rectangular frame. While this may seem a step backwards, it's also important to consider that this coincides in time exactly with the rejection of these artists from the Communist Party, which preempted their revolutionary agenda. It's essentially pulling the rug from under their feet after a whole aesthetic theory had been built up, justified in Marxist terms and justified in terms of communism. Suddenly the Communist Party takes the Soviet line and accuses them of being bourgeois, elitist, not doing an art of the masses, what very predictably, I mean, we could all see that coming, but it seems that they didn't. It also coincides with the first trips of these artists to Europe, where they found a moral and intellectual support network that was lacking in Argentina, those networks that I think are going to come up many times in the discussion today. It was also the end of the war, and Argentina was developing its own political model under Juan Domingo Perón, who turned out to be less of a Nazi than was initially suspected. So to return to Juan Melé's Marco Recortado número 2, this work really represents that crucial moment at which aesthetic innovation and revolutionary politics were trying to coexist in the same object. And if the work is not entirely successful in either of these purposes, it nonetheless can still move us in the sincerity of its belief and the energy of its convictions. Created at a crucial point in the move from the excitement of the adoption of the structured frame in 1944 and the realization of the inevitability of illusionism in abstraction in late 1946, Melé's painting is literally on the edge of so many key questions and contradictions in the history of abstract art, not least the question of how to reconcile radical politics with visual form. Thank you.